Hi everyone, Timothy Ferris here with a few words about global warming. Specifically, I'd like to address three popular misconceptions about what's properly called anthropogenic global warming. That is, warming of the planet caused by human activities such as burning fossil fuels. The first of these misconceptions is that global warming is some kind of a fad or a recent passion amongst scientists, that there's really nothing to worry about. Second, that humans are indeed causing global warming, but that somehow it's okay. It gets cold in the winter, it'd be nice if everything was warmer. The third misconception is that it's real, but somehow too expensive to repair. So let's address each of those in turn. First, the idea that global warming is some newfound scientific fad or hoax, along the lines of, the hoax of the Piltdown Man, or the widespread assumption among some scientists, by no means a majority, back in the 1970s or so, that the Earth was headed for some kind of hideous disaster because of typically overpopulation or other dangers that in retrospect were seen to have been exaggerated or entirely misunderstood. Global warming isn't like that. The history of global warming science goes back for centuries. In the 1700s and 1800s, it was thought that the Earth had remained warm even though it radiates much of the heat it receives from the sun into space, because the hot core of the Earth kept warming it. This was okay as long as you kept to a chronology of the Earth's history, rather similar to that the scholars of the Bible tried to estimate, which put the Earth at no more than about 10,000 years of age. But Darwin's theory of evolution showed that the Earth must be much older than that, and astronomical and geological evidence has confirmed that our planet's about 4.5 billion years old. Simply having a hot core would not keep the planet warm enough that long. The discovery that radioactive elements are also down there, heavy elements that have sunk to the core of the Earth when it was a molten ball, and that helps warm the Earth too. In fact, if we didn't have radioactive materials on Earth, if this was not a radioactive planet, we wouldn't have the geological life that causes volcanoes and everything, and which makes biological life possible. But radiation as well didn't account for the full antiquity of a warm and habitable Earth. That turned out to be due to what's called greenhouse warming. The fact that the Earth's atmosphere is transparent to visible light, the light strikes the surface of the Earth, and then some of that energy is re-radiated as longer wavelengths of light called infrared light, which we can't see, we can feel as heat, but which is then trapped in the atmosphere because the same layers of atmosphere that are transparent to visible light are somewhat opaque to infrared light. So the heat gets trapped in there, and that's what has kept the Earth at what we humans would regard as comfortable temperatures over long periods of time. This was not a new discovery. The mechanism of trapping invisible infrared light as heat was identified by Swiss alpineers back in the 1700s. By 1908, scientists were already beginning to speculate that greenhouse gases emitted from the smokestacks of factories might one day start warming the entire planet. In the early Industrial Revolution, really no one anticipated the tremendous exponential growth rate in productivity that also would mean an exponential rise in the production of greenhouse gases. By the 1930s, actual warming of the planet caused by industrial emissions was beginning to be measured by scientists. And in the 1950s, Charles Keeling of Caltech was able to get funding to set up 3 atmospheric monitoring stations in Alaska, Hawaii, and California to measure the growing amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere from sites that were distant from nearby factories that might otherwise skew the result. So that's more than 70 years ago that global warming had not only been observed and connected to industrial activity, but that rises in greenhouse gases were being seen as well. So global warming caused by human activities is real. What about the second assertion that, okay, it's real, but it'll be all right. Everybody likes warm weather. Well, there are a couple of problems with that. First of all, just to speak parochially here in the United States, we have the greatest breadbasket of farm production in the world. Do we, in fact, want to move that breadbasket up into Canada and inherit a climate situation more akin to that of Mexico, while Mexico inherits one that's more equatorial? There are a lot of disruptions that take place with long-term global warming. In the end, they can get quite serious indeed. It's not something that we can simply shrug our shoulders and say we're going to live with, okay. At the end of that line of thought, if we were really to continue burning fossil fuels and otherwise amping up global warming as we have been doing now for many generations, lie genuinely apocalyptic scenarios like that presented to us by the sight in the sky of the brilliantly shining planet Venus. Venus is in many regards a twin to Earth, about the same size and mass, but the temperature on the surface of Venus is hot enough to melt lead. Reason? Runaway greenhouse effect. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere of Venus has trapped the sunlight, and the planet went into what are called nonlinear events, that is, where you start to get exponential growth in heat, in this case, too rapidly for your countermeasures to bring it back down. The skeptics about global warming like to point out that the scientists' computational models, which try to model the atmosphere of the entire Earth, are inexact. Of course they're inexact. The Earth is enormous and subtle. The maps are improving, the models are improving, but they are not yet 100% equal to the real Earth. So skeptics say, well, the models don't really tell you exactly what will happen. And that's true. If you find that all the fish in a pond have died and you find there's a pipe leaking cyanide into the pond, it's true that you can't model the pond in every detail, but you can turn off the cyanide, and the odds are that if you reintroduce fish after the cyanide is out of the water, they'll do okay. You didn't need a model of the pond that was accurate down to the molecular level, and you don't need an exact model to understand what global warming is doing, at least in gross terms, to our planet. The danger here is nonlinear effects, where small inputs can produce large outputs. In economic terms, one needs to make fixes to global warming before the problem gets out of hand, which I define as before the problem becomes so expensive to fix that the cost exceeds the total output of the global economy. Which leads us to our third misconception that, okay, global warming is real and it's dangerous, but we can't fix it. That somehow maybe it's too expensive or it's beyond our capacity to fix. That's not the case, at least not yet. But there are a few variables in addressing global warming that one wants to keep in mind because they don't show up so often in the public debate. For instance, if we just look in ideological terms, the ideological right, the anti-scientific right, including religious believers who reject all science, has to get past those prejudices if it's to come to grips with global warming. The ideological left needs to do the same thing. It's time to stop their irrational objection, for instance, to nuclear power, the safest and least greenhouse impactful form of energy yet invented. All sides need to recognize the problem of having polluting elements in our economies that do not pay for themselves. We've established at law already that it's illegal now to, for instance, dump pollutants into a river upstream of a city, even if the city's in another state or even if it's in another country, because you're getting a profit from simply getting rid of the pollutants without having to pay for the waste disposal. And that cost to the environment doesn't show up on your balance sheets. That's why so many Democrats and Republicans alike in the U.S. used to support a carbon tax, which would reflect the cost of cleaning up carbon emissions and put it in the form of a tax on those who emit the carbon. This was a bipartisan issue a decade or so ago. Now it's become a matter of political wrangling. Everybody needs to stop obsessing about relatively meaningless talking points. Every discussion of nuclear power, for instance, someone will bring up the terrible hazards of nuclear waste. We handle toxic waste all the time in all the industrialized societies. Accidents are extremely rare. The entire history of the nuclear industry in the United States has not resulted in the death by radiation of a single individual. So we need to stop thinking in terms of passionately held beliefs that are factually ungrounded and talk solely in terms of scientific facts. The assertion that cleaning up global warming would be too expensive is simply not supported by the scientific facts. We need smarter tech, and we need more social willingness to spend what it takes for the preservation of our environment as a whole. And there is a subtle point in this that isn't always appreciated, and that is that money spent today is more expensive than money spent in the future. So spending a lot of money right now in some kind of crash program is not always the best idea, because there is a falling curve of the value of money, and there's meantime a rising curve in global warming and a rising curve in the wealth of the liberal democracies, which means their ability to spend the money to deal with this problem. Finding a sweet spot in all that isn't easy, but it's made much more difficult if one starts with mere assertions of ideological belief or personal faith. What we need is clear-headed quantitative thinking, and that's been going on in the scientific community, as I say, for many generations now. The trouble is that scientific thinking doesn't percolate very much into political thought. There are almost no scientists in the parliaments and congresses of most of the liberal democracies around the world. To sum up, first, global warming is real. It's not a hoax or a fad. It's basic planetology, and it's been understood to some degree in scientific circles for well over a century now. Second, it's not going to make things better. We're not all going to be lying out playing by the pool. If we don't turn things around on global warming, we're going to start to see mass migrations out of areas where the climate has decimated the ability to support humans. And third, it can be addressed. There are many subtleties to it. It doesn't necessarily have to be addressed by big state programs. A good deal is going on individual levels, better monitoring the planet and better responding to the challenges. But as a society, this and the other liberal democracies need to stop quibbling about cherished beliefs and pay attention to the facts and decide what kind of a planet we're going to leave to our children and their children. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time.